want to talk a little bit about how you figure out how to get the ratios right for picking up stitches. Sometimes people know the general concept, but the idea of how many you pick up can sometimes be a little daunting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens with that. We'll look at two different places you might be picking up stitches. One would be at a bind off or cast on edge of the work, so across here or across here. And generally those ones are pretty straightforward because you've got one stitch across here, and if you're going to be picking up stitches that work at the same gauge, you pick up one stitch for each point. The only time that might be different is if you were changing to a different stitch pattern, and so therefore there was potentially a different gauge. So if it was something that had a much tighter stitch pattern, so say for instance this is 18 stitches per 4 inches, but the stitch pattern you're working was perhaps 24 stitches per 4 inches, then you would need several more stitches picked up in between. So you might pick up exactly what you've got here and then perhaps increase on the next row. Or if you were picking up something that was going to be worked as ribbing, you might actually want that as a tighter gauge, in which case you would leave it as every one, and then because of the fact that it's a tighter gauge, it's actually going to pull in which you'd want for ribbing. So it's going to depend on how you actually, what you want it for. So in terms of how I pick stitches up, I'll give a brief demonstration here. For along the edge here, I just go ahead and pick up, you can see just right in underneath where it's, this case I think this was the cast on, just straight in underneath it, one stitch per one, and I just wrap it around as though I'm actually knitting with the work, just like this. So I'll just pop it in under here and wrap it as though I'm knitting with the work. So it's pretty straightforward and it gives a nice clean, tidy result, and you can just work right across here. Now the second spot that you might be wanting to pick ones up is along the edge of work like this. And in this case you're picking up along rows, and so because you're knitting out this way, you're going to be knitting stitches, but the row gauge is different. And that's where the ratios come into play. If you're working through a pattern, they'll usually tell you specifically. They might say, across this bit of work, you need to pick up 20 stitches. And that's because the designer has just calculated the ratio for you. If you'd like to do it yourself or adjust it, I can show you what the ratios are. If you want to go exactly according to the numbers but find it kind of tricky, what you can do is you could divide it like this and then use a marker to place where you have half the stitches here, pick up half the number of stitches here. So if it was 20, it would be 10 to here and then 10 to here, and that makes it a little bit more straightforward. If you're just a couple of stitches off, you can make adjustments in the following row. If you've got a few too little, you can increase a couple. If you've got a few too much, you can decrease a couple. So I wouldn't worry too much if you've just got a small little difference like that. If you want to actually do the ratios yourself, this is just kind of an example, a couple examples of how it would go. In this particular one, I'm assuming that the stitch pattern is 18 stitches per 4 inches, and it's got 24 rows per those 4 inches. So what you're doing is you're just dividing down with what's known as a common denominator, in this case 6, and so that'll divide to 3, and that divides down to 4. And what that means for you is for every 4 rows you pick up 3 stitches. So what you'll do is you'll pick up 1, 2, 3, skip a row, and that's how the ratio works. It means that you've got the right number of stitches for the width of the work, and it's quite straightforward to do. This is a different example here where I was assuming there was 16 stitches and 24 rows, and in that case you would be picking up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. So I'll show you how that is going to look here. I'll take my yarn along the edge here, and so I say I'm going to do the 2 for 3 on this one. So I'll come along the edge here, try to get one kind of fairly down near the edge, but it's kind of a bit messy and sloppy often, those small corners. So I pick up 1 and 2, and you can see I'm trying to move 1 stitch in right from the edge, and then the next one here I'm going to skip, and then I do the same thing again. You see I go right through the middle of the stitch here. Make sure you stay the same point all the way along to give a lovely clean edge. 1, and then the next one is 2. Then we're going to skip 1. This one's going to be skipped. Kind of see it if you spread it apart, there's another hole. And then you go 1, 2, you'd skip 1, and then you continue up. And you can see when you make sure to enter it into the same point all the way along, you get a very clean edge. So there, that's just kind of how I think through the process of ratios for picking up stitches.